Welcome everyone to the Data Science Hangout. I'm your host, Rachel Dempsey. But for anyone who's just joining for the first time, this is an open space for current and aspiring data science leaders to connect and chat about some of the more human-centric questions around data science leadership. But really it's just an opportunity to focus on questions that are most important to you all as well. So you can jump in live or put questions in the chat. And we also have a Slido link, so you can ask questions anonymously too. And Robert, I'm sure we'll share that in the chat window in just a second here. But just a quick note, this will be a recorded session, so we will share it up to YouTube for anyone that missed it. But I'm so excited to be joined today by my co-host, Jacqueline Nolis, head of data science at Saturn Cloud. And Jacqueline's led data science, machine learning, and AI projects also at Microsoft, Adobe, Airbnb, and T-Mobile. And she's also co-wrote the book on building a career in data science. So happy to have you here today. Would love to have you introduce yourself and maybe just share a little bit about some of the work that you're doing today.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Nolis. Yes, a little bit about me. I got an undergrad and master's in mathematics. Then I want to go get a job using data to help businesses. This is before data science was a term. So I did that for a while. Then I said, nah, I want to go to academia. I got a PhD. Said, no, I want to go back in industry. So then I consulted for many years, including at a bunch of the companies Rachel mentioned. And then I recently started, maybe not that recently anymore. I'm now the head of data science at Saturn Cloud, and Saturn Cloud is a cloud platform for data scientists to run Jupyter notebooks and things like that, and use DAS clusters for distributed computing. And I will say I've used R for about 10 years now, and it's been a really fun journey. And R is my favorite language to use these days, even if the company I currently am employed by is more of a Python place.
And Jacqueline, I think it's also helpful for people maybe to understand some of the projects that you work on at Saturn Cloud as well, and like what your team looks like too.
Sure. Well, okay. So throughout my career, I have started to lead data science teams. Like when I was a consultant, I created a data science department at my company that had like 8 data scientists and managers managing. So that got fairly big. Then like when I went to T-Mobile and helped consult there, I like helped them start their AI team. So I've done a lot of helping teams start and then growing up teams. At Saturn Cloud, I'm actually, because we are a product for data scientists, I'm less of a like do analytics and build models and more of like product development of like what do data scientists like want, and how can we build documentation and examples and like help our customers solve their problems, that kind of work. And so that's what the team I lead does now. But it's actually, the thinking of it is fairly similar. It's not as different as you'd expect from purely I'm gonna a neural network kind of data science.
Awesome. So I get to ask the questions in the beginning when people are thinking about what they want. So I'm curious, what's something that you're really excited about in data science right now?
That is a great question. I think that I have found it really fun to watch in like the last 3 years, I would say, maybe a little more than that, but it's gotten really easy to use the most cutting edge models, I would think. Like it used to be that like, well, like, way back when, like, well, you could use a linear regression or a logistic regression, or maybe if you really put some work into it, a random forest. But if you want to do something advanced, you need a blah, blah, blah. And now it's like, man, with PyTorch, TensorFlow, XGBoost, LightGBL, like they're really, the difference between the most powerful models and the powerful models that are powerful enough that you can use them on a day-to-day basis has gotten really small. I think that's really cool because we have to, there's less like, oh, you only use a blah, blah, blah. You haven't even tried to use a blah, blah. Like there's less of that because we can all just kind of use everything now. So it's just not as big of a deal. So I appreciate that is kind of not as much of the conversation as I feel like it used to be. So maybe the thing of data science is it feels like there's less gatekeeping than there used to be. And I think that's great.
That's awesome. And I know we got to talk to you a little, or I feel like I got to talk to you at our studio webinar where we had the building effective data science teams, even though that was Julia interviewing you. But something that I thought was really interesting from that conversation was this whole idea of like distributed versus centralized data science teams. And I know you had a kind of set idea on that. And I think it'd be interesting for everyone to hear a bit more about that too.
Yeah, so I will actually tell a story around this. So this is back when I was the head of a data science team at a consulting firm, and some like one of these Gartner reports or like Forrester kind of a company was asking us of like, what is your stance on distributed versus centralized data science? Meaning, do you think at a company the data scientists should all live on individual teams, like you should have the data science marketing and the data science blah blah blah, or should you have one central data science team that all the data science report to, and there's more like a consulting firm that kind of goes out and helps? And at the time when I was working on this, and we're a consulting company, we didn't want to harm and offend anyone. We did a very consulting company thing. We just said, we think there's reasons why you'd want to use all of them, and we just kind of like absolutely punted on like, who's to say what is the right thing? And I actually held that belief for like in my heart for a fair amount of time. I'm like, different models for different companies, there's always a good place for some, and now in 2021, I feel actually pretty definitively like in most situations, the decentralized method is better, which is to say, have your data science teams really close to the people who are there helping is better than having data scientists close to each other. Because when data scientists get close to each other, what do? They really like talking to each other about really complex models and building really complex things. When you have the data scientists close to the teams they're working on, then you actually can like solve the more practical problems. And like, I think there are uses for companies having consultancy style data scientists going in and helping with like the tricky stuff, but I do think it's better to have data scientists scattered throughout.
And how, like, have you ever had to go from one way to the other or to try and distribute everyone?
I think I have almost, well, like I've either been at like a small company where like we just have one data science team because there's only 50 people, or usually, well, actually I've kind of been on both. I've been at companies where there's just one central data science team, and I've been on companies where each team has its own data science team. I do think there are times where all of them backfire. Like I've seen teams, I consulted for a certain large tech company, and they had, within one product, they had like 10 data science teams all basically doing the same thing, all fighting with each other. And like, that's not a good use of decentralizing. So I've kind of been on all of it, but yeah, I think having your data scientists close to the people they're trying to help is still like the generally right call. Also, I don't know if you guys can hear it. My cat is super loud and annoying. So I'm gonna go kick him out of the room and I'll be right back. 1 second.
Or just bring the cat to the hangout. Bruno says, show us the cat.
That's next week's speaker.
Yeah.
I don't wanna. Yeah.
I follow up on that. And
yeah, sure.
How, so specialization, right, to an extent is a positive thing. How do you feel about having the person that is awesome at forecasting sitting in just one of those business unit teams versus the person that, right, has spent a lot of time doing cluster analysis and then figuring that out? Do you see, not that I disagree with you or wholeheartedly, I'm just looking at the other side of it. When you have these individuals who are really, really good at things and then they get stuck kind of in a corner, which is great for that team that has them, but not so great for everybody else in the company. How do you see that balance playing out, or have you seen it play out well anywhere?
I think that what you just said is the justification for having some sort of internal consultancy. Like if you really have a rock star forecaster, put them on the team of people that goes around and just talks to the other people to like get their forecasting up. Like I think if you have 100 data scientists at a company, you could have 10 or something who are that style of like, I'm just going to go around and make all of our forecasting better. And then the other 90 are actually like more in the field doing it. I'd said, I think there's actually a lot of risk too in having people specialize. I've been in a lot of situations where like, and maybe it's just because I tend to work at smaller companies, but like people have a desire to specialize too quickly and like, oh, we're gonna have this person. Like there's so much risk in having this one person be the forecast person and they're gonna do forecasts and no one else knows how to do forecasts but that one person. Like then that person gets bored of forecasting. If they quit, your company's in a really bad position. You're much better off, I feel like, avoiding those sorts of scenarios and making so everyone knows a little forecasting, or at least like like 10% of the people know forecast and they can swap around rather than having everyone only have one specialty. Like, I think I've seen occasionally problems where people don't specialize enough, but much more often problems where people specialize too much. And again, I think it really depends on company size. So,
how do you also have the team? Like I'm imagining when it's decentralized, and you said it's not as many data scientists just all talking together. How do they also help train each other on different topics, or like keep up to date on certain things if you're working on a separate department? Or
I don't know. Like, I think you can get clever with like Slack channels and like monthly meetings where we all get together and just socialize, right? Like, that's more about like creating human connections than it is about like having an internalized process. But like, if everyone's friends, then it doesn't super matter, because like when something goes wrong, you just go ask your friend. So that's more about like creating human connections than like formal processes, I would say.
yeah.
But I don't know. I think that like also like at some level, like, I don't know, I usually learn more about data science from blog posts than I do from coworkers. So like, it's less about having all your coworkers talk necessarily. Some internal information maybe, but like a lot of it's also just like making sure your data science teams have the time to go out and learn new things and stay informed.
Thank you. I see there's an anonymous question that came in that is, Anaconda Enterprise and our studio community, at first glance, they look feature equal. If you had to choose one.
I mean, I'm here. I'm not on an Anaconda content right now. I mean, I'm really happy with what sort of things we're doing at Saturn Cloud. Like, I'm pretty happy with the kind of tooling we're building there. But I do think, from what I have seen on the Python community, it is a lot of work to try and get it to be as I don't know, nice and social as the R one. For whatever reason, I think our communities are just more like fun, chill places to be. But again, I don't know, that's where I came from, so maybe I'm biased.
I think that leads to like another question that I would have as we wait for a few others to come in. But are you pretty open across your team to like whatever tools people want to use, or how do you standardize on certain tools?
Okay, so I will say I have watched a lot of teams crash into the ground because there's one person who likes SPSS, and so they know SPSS, so they're going to write an SPSM rather than them learning the language everyone else uses. I have been that person, not with SPSS, but with like F#. Like, I have committed that sin, and I have personally crashed projects to the ground because of this. I think there is a very real risk of letting people go in and do whatever they want and then having chaos. I also think concurrently that if you never let people use the tools they like, your employees are sad, and also your product is less good because people like particular things for a reason. So I think anytime you put in a new technology, it is a group decision. It has to be some level of group like thinking, like at the last company I was with, like we were primarily using Python and we were like going to use R, and like, do we have enough people to support R? Blah, blah, blah. Like that is a conversation, and not just like, well, I like R, so I'm going to use it. And I think this is especially hard if you're one of the very early people on the team, because every time you make, if you're the only data scientist and things start, every decision you make about, well, I like this best, is also a decision for all the future people. So it really matters that you think about this stuff. So I tend to lean on this. I guess I lean more on the authoritarian, no, don't let people use whatever they want, because I've watched it so much crash in the ground. And then I like try and fight that back a little, because I'm like, I got to let people be happy, I guess. So.
I think, oh, sorry, you go.
Oh, no problem. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Jacqueline, with the idea of the decentralized, I'm a big proponent of that. One thing that I wish I could get to be more successful is letting people move around a company. So I've been successful over my career actually getting decentralized, but then often the groups, the managers over the groups that have the data scientists don't want them to ever move anywhere. And I'm not sure how to get more buy-in from the higher executives to help push that along. So I think that really helps build that community and the friendships where you start getting the good collaboration without the overlap. Do you have any tips there? I would love to hear your
No, but I will not do I not have tips, but I'll answer a different question that's related to your question. So it still sounds like I'm insightful. Well, I will first say I've never actually done what you've described of been working at one department of the company and then switched to a different. I've always stayed in a particular team until I've been like left, basically, for whatever reason. It's just not a thing that I've really pursued. That said, I think what you're describing is something I have dealt with a lot, which is when I think there's a culture change that needs to happen at an organization, and I don't know how to get people to notice that. In your case, the culture change is people lock in too much on, hey, I like this employee, so they're going to stay with me forever, and not, hey, it's better to let people move and grow. That helps everyone, like the tragedy of commons style way. That is a culture change. I have a lot of times been at companies where I'm like, we are doing something that is disadvantageous to our whole company, but the people at the top don't understand it. And I need to help them do that. Here's the bad news, which is I've been in lots of those situations. I don't know how many of them I'm actually succeeding in getting anyone at a higher up than me to really change a culture. You know, I'm just I don't know, maybe you can notice this about me. I'm a very outgoing and loud person. And so I will really bring up these sorts of issues of like, hey, we need to let people go around more, things like that. And occasionally I can get people above me to make changes, but like more often than not, they're like, well, I don't know. And it's just like, there's a certain like power imbalance where like, I can never make people with more power do things. And I've had to learn how to be very strategic about deciding when to really push on stuff, when to just let stuff go and not care about it, or when to say, this is so catastrophically bad, it is no longer worth it for me to be here. So I don't know if I have necessarily tips on how you can get those sorts of changes to happen. But what I would say is maybe the better question isn't how can you make them happen? It's when you're in an environment where you can't make the things you want happen, how do you react to that? Yeah, actually, sorry. I've been in a lot of these situations where I've had people above me really making bad calls, including some like diversity stuff where like, it's like, it's very frustrating. Like I put a lot of heart and soul into it and then just have the people above me be like, no. And it's just like, yeah, it's very demoralizing. So I'm getting a little worked up thinking about it.
Wow, that's terrible leadership.
That's why I don't work with those companies anymore.
I feel
good call.
like this is an important topic to stay on for a little bit, and I'm curious if other people have other tips or advice as well.
I will say the last 5 years of my career have in large part been a form of me learning how to navigate these situations. Because I think that really as you get to like principal levels and up, it just more and more, hey, the people at the top have some ideas that maybe you don't agree with, and what are you going to do with that? So, not only they have ideas you don't agree with, they hire you to fix those problems. And they're like, we want you to fix these problems. Also, we won't let you fix these problems. What are you going to do? And it's just like, that's just how to handle that has been a thing I've really been focusing on.
And is that something that you also are training people that work for you to do, or like how to have those conversations?
A bit. I'm also trying to not be those people, right? Like, I think there's just a certain amount of like, how can I be a good leader and make sure that the people under me are given both clear direction on what they want them to do and a clear understanding of what they can and what I, as their leader, can and cannot do and why. And make sure those are in sync. And I really have been trying more on that. But I do think training people to be good navigating on that's important as well.
Eric, I see you have a question you put into the chat, which I'm not going to just read. So I'm going to ask if it's okay if I turn the mic over to you for a second.
Absolutely. First, Jacqueline, huge fan of yours. And I'm just going to say GGIRL is just straight up amazing. I will keep saying that forever. As a Shiny enthusiast, I even watched a recording of your New York presentation just recently. Amazing stuff. Anyway, it kind of leads to what I'm about to talk about here is that I work with a lot of people that ask for my strategic input on maybe scoping out a data science tool, whether it's a package or a Shiny app or things like that. And I give them some high level recommendations and they start prototyping it. And this prototype can go quite quickly from some that was just meant to show how something worked to then they just build and build and build on top of it until you get to a situation where the leadership wants to use this in production, but it is most definitely not ready for production because of some shortcuts they took and things like that. So I guess from your experience, what have you done to still encourage innovation in your teams or with your colleagues? But yet, when you sense that maybe something's about to get really popular really quickly, how to empower those, developers to think about, well, it's probably going to be used in production, so I might want to shore up this area or things like that. I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
So I will say that in a sense, this is actually very related to the last question, because in some, and I think maybe every question anyone asks on this chat, I'll be like, these are all the same questions, right? Which is, in your case, it's like at some level, people at your company have an incentive to put stuff out the door because it makes them look good. And like you are helping customers, presumably is a net benefit. You also have an incentive not to have this blow up on its face, or not to be teched at, in the next year where suddenly you're like, oh, this is a huge hurdle. And if we just put 5, extra minutes of effort in. So you have these different incentives, and it's kind of your job to be the person to, like, even if you don't have the most power, you kind of have to do this thing of like, well, how can I, as a person who isn't have the most power, try and guide the team to doing the right thing? And I think, because you can't just tell people, no, you can't roll this out yet, the best thing you can do is really, it's like, this is like a soft power, like discussion sort of a thing of like, well, let's talk about what the risks are of rolling it out here, and like why we care about unit testing and like these sorts of things. And as much as possible, let's say it's a unit test. Let's say you make a cool API and you haven't put any unit tests in it. They're like, cool, let's just put it in prod. Something like unit tests, you could go to a person and be like, you really need to put unit tests in it. And they'll be like, whatever, teach. Like, I don't know what that means. That sounds like a lot of work. And the more you can both explain to them why, hey, unit testing helps avoid these things, blah, blah. But then also, if you can actually like write some unit tests, set up the scaffolding. Like a lot of times the reasons why people don't do things isn't because they don't want to make stuff good. It's because they don't necessarily know how. And sometimes even just setting up a little bit of the scaffolding can really go a long way. And I think that's kind of what I think about like a principal data scientist job. It is like entirely to do that. It's to help like get people started in the right direction. So like write the first few unit tests. Think through, what is the microservice architecture going to look like so we don't build a giant monolith? Like just trying to do that kind of stuff in advance in a way that's like a soft power. Look, I showed you, let's just see if we can do it. I think that's kind of like, that kind of stuff really helps.
Yeah, one follow-up on that is I'm in an industry that historically has been kind of lagging behind in thinking about these newer ways of thinking of how data science is a very intricate field, that we have lots of touches on just the statistics side, but also the software development side, the architecture design. And sometimes it's hard to get some leaders to recognize that the skills that you literally just mentioned of scoping things out correctly, getting them set up correctly, instilling these principles early on is not something that's in people's typical job descriptions for the role I'm in. So sometimes for me, it's sometimes been a challenge to get these kind of skills recognized and valued accordingly. So I don't know if you've experienced
Yeah,
that.
let me give a very concrete example of this. So as I imagine most people on this call know, it is generally best if you have code in a shared repository that people commit and push and pull. It is generally worse if you have a data science team where everyone has everything on their own laptop with no structure and different formats. Like maybe they run this report once a week, but if they threw away the laptop, you have to rebuild the whole report. So I had at one of my consulting things, I'd gone just from being a team where everyone uses Git and we all have a clear system with folders and blah, 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 to a team of like 30 data scientists. 90% of them didn't use Git. Some of them, like I said, use SPSS, blah, blah, blah. And like, that is bad. That is bad for a lot of reasons. If someone were to leave, that company would be really bad. Like we can't even keep track of like what code actually is running in prod because everyone has their own stuff. Now, when I come in to be like, I objectively know that the team I've just been working on before with Git and folders and whatever, CI/CD, that is objectively better. But to try and do the work of getting everyone to switch to using Git and a shared language, that is a massive amount of work. I could not do that. I don't even think, and I've thought about this a lot, I don't even think the person running that team of 20 could have gotten everyone to do that because the problem was just so big at that point. Had they started 3 years earlier, it would have been fine. But at that point, 20 people, all these different systems, it just would be very, very difficult. So I do think there's a certain point of no return of like, we just have to accept that this is not going to be a system that runs well and hope that as they build future systems, it will. And as much as possible, trying to catch stuff early so you don't get there too.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Man, thinking about the stuff, it's like, woof, it's bringing back, like, man, imagine being on a team with no Git and some people use SPSS. Like, I don't know. It's very dramatic.
So there's an anonymous question that just came in on how do you structure internal documentation or communication channels so people can be empowered by the internal data science team?
So I have maybe two hot takes that I think are maybe not generally like standard what people believe. One is I think that a lot of times data science teams write too much documentation. And two, I don't think they put it in the right place, or like they don't think enough about what the right place for it is, which is to say, let's say I am a data science team and we have some stakeholders work with us. One thing you might say is like, well, the stakeholders is asking us questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write like a doc on our wiki page, and it's going to be a huge doc with every question answered in it. And a data science team will spend weeks building this giant repository of all this information. And then what do you know? The first thing is no one looks at it because it has too much information. Even if they did look at it, everyone has new weird questions that show up. So those docs wouldn't really answer it. The docs are written to avoid having to take meetings and stuff with these people. But in fact, you still have to take just as much meetings. Now you've just spent weeks of time building something that you then also have to maintain. So I think there's this natural data science feeling of like, well, if I just write everything down, people will stop talking to me anymore. I don't think that is generally true. I think the best kind of documentation data scientists can do is one, for themselves, I think within your code, having readmes, having your functions documented, having good testing, good variable names, like that stuff I do really think helps quite immensely. And making sure all this code lives in a shared place where it's not like we have a GitHub repo for one thing and a GitLab repo for another and blah, blah, blah. Like just having things organized is just as valuable as documented. And then the other thing I think is that, yeah, you really can't document your way out of talking to stakeholders. And the best thing you can do is just getting it so stakeholders know that what is the most effective way to communicate with you. Is it if they have a request, you drop it in the Jira board? Is it, hey, there's this is the project manager, they always take the meetings first. Like just having that clear system. So you can't minimize the work, but by having it in a flow, you can at least like manage it as opposed to fire drill requests coming everywhere. I think that stuff is far more valuable than like, yeah, let's write lots of docs.
What kind of system do you use for requests?
So I do think that you have a person on your team who's the project manager person, and maybe that's actually a project manager, maybe that's the principal data scientist, whatever, but someone whose job it is to triage requests. You then have, when anyone has a request they want to make of you, they either talk to that person or drop it in the Jira board or whatever board. And then that person looks at it, tries to understand it, goes back to them, has a meeting about it to really clean it up. And then from there, the data science team tackles it. I think some sort of intake method like that works best. I think creating a standard form that they fill out, that kind of stuff doesn't really work because every question will never fit into a form because it always have its weird edge cases. And I also think, yeah, I think just having a person who everyone knows is the point of contact on this just makes it a lot easier. And like, I don't know, I find that job really fun. I love talking to people about what their problems are. Like, so it's not necessarily like a bad job, but it is something where you should have one person who's really the point of contact on it. So it's not like, well, some requests go to me and some requests go to blah, blah, blah. And some, oh, they have to have a lunch with this person back when people have lunch together. Now they have an extra request. Like having one clear point of contact really helps.
Thank you. Ian, I see you asked a question in the chat around building a team up from scratch. Do you want to jump in and add any more context to that one?
Sure. Hi, Jacqueline. I just wanted to know, you mentioned going in, starting all of these teams from scratch. Was there a common denominator, this common thing that you would experience in companies where there's maybe not a data-centric culture or there's not a big understanding of what data science is? Was there a common thing that, hurdle or something you had to overcome to kind of get buy-in or, just to even start the team off?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, usually if they are hiring you, there's got to be like some vague buy-in at the company in the sense that like you wouldn't have been hired if at least someone somewhere didn't think data science would be useful. So because I guess I would, which is to say, I used to worry that like, am I going to get buy-in for this? That's kind of gone away. Usually it's like there is buy-in, but there's a total lack of idea of how to actually make it work, which is to say, and I've had this happen a few times where you come to a company, you start a team, but the question is like, is there actually data we can use? Is this data actually useful, right? Like, so if they hire you with the expectation of like, you're going to build machine learning models on the revenue data to blah, blah, blah. And then it turns out like 2 months in that like, there's not enough data here that you'd ever be able to build models on it or stuff like that. That stuff keeps me up at night, but I don't think there's any real way to solve it besides before getting hired, really try and like probe on if this seems like a good chance for data science, and really just being flexible with once you do start, like it may turn out that the actual data science work you're doing isn't what you originally expected. And it's just like, that's kind of the learning experience of being the first one. I will also say to the previous or earlier point, when you are the first data scientist you are or the first data scientist, everything you do sets a precedent. If you pick R or you pick Python, now everyone's going to use R or Python. If you use a Git repo or blah, 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 like, so it really, more than any other time, you being careful about what you're doing is going to pay off in the future. And also, you have to, at the same time, and here's the twist, you can't just be like, I'm going to build a beautiful cathedral of Git repos with CI/CD, blah, 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 because you'll spend the first 6 months of your job setting up all this tooling, no one else to use it yet. And after 6 months of not actually doing work and just building tooling, you will be let go. And so it was all for naught. So it's like, it is like a strategic game of like, where do you actually invest, given you can only do so much investing while concurrently trying to produce revenue. I think being the first data scientist is extremely fun, but that is quite a stressful thing. And like, I don't know, that's maybe not for everyone.
Awesome, thanks.
It sounds like maybe that has happened before, where you get there and you don't have the data that you actually need to do what they want you to do. Like how did you actually handle that?
Well, you have to have some real frank conversations with your leadership about, hey, you hired me to do thing X, Y, and Z, but thing X, Y, and Z is impossible. Let's talk about what is possible and how I can do it. And if you have a strong set of leaders, they'll be like, you are a data science expert. I trust you on that. Let's have that conversation and pivot. And if they are weak leaders, they will say, well, you just don't know enough about data science. We're going to keep doing the same thing because we know more than you. And then that is like a, I don't know, not great situation. Those are the sorts of situations where like, me being here isn't really right for me or you. So, meh.
Yeah, definitely. Julie, I see you just put a question into the chat as well on tips for denying requests. Would you want to jump in and provide any other context for that one?
Sure, absolutely. So I work at a hospital where we have a fairly new data science team. And the problem with hospitals is that they tend to be very hierarchical, in that everybody's first idea is always would go as high up in the hierarchy as possible to ask what we should solve. Whereas I maybe have the understanding that the good ideas actually come from the people who work with the patients and do all of the stuff whose work we're supposed to be helping. And I haven't figured out a good way to triage where people I work with are not necessarily comfortable saying to the high ups that this might not be the best use of our resources. And I also am not senior enough to maybe be able to do that myself. So if you have any ideas on how to, as you say, like try to bring the reality into the conversation, that would be really cool.
So I will first say, you said, well, I'm not necessarily senior enough. I think that is a astute observation, which is, I think a lot of times people get on these calls and be like, the way, like, you could be the lowest person at a company, and if you pitch your idea just right, people are going to love it. And like, that's not really true. Like, they're like, positions are real, and sometimes being more senior gets stuff. So like, I think it is good that you are aware that that stuff exists and you're navigating around that. That said, the most luck I have had in these things, in these sorts of situations, is just trying to like pivot the pitch from not like, hey, I'm more a senior person, you're wrong and here's why, although that's maybe how I feel, but much more like, hey, how can I show you, senior person, the things I am seeing that are making me think that the more junior way of doing things are, right? So if like the senior person, like, we need to build a whole new data platform or whatever, and you're like, no, we really just need to like go survey some hospital beds, right? Like the more you can be like, well, let me explain why, let me show you some data, like the more you can kind of, it's not like, hey, I need you to change your mind. It's like, I'm going to bring you into this new, even better idea. Like that's kind of thinking helps, which is to say, most of what you're kind of asking about, and I think has repeatedly come up on this call, is like organizational dynamics. And like the things that have helped me the most in my career, get good at these are books on like negotiation and like getting to yes and difficult conversations, just like answering the question of how do I convince another person to do the thing that I think we should do. Like that is totally unrelated to data science and very much a like business philosophy, like argument, meta conversation, you know, like, and I think just really thinking about it that way and trying to look in those resources help. But like, it's very tricky, and it's I would love more than anything to have an answer for you of like, oh well, if you just said these 3 words, then they have to do, here's the code words. But at least I've not yet found anything of the sort.
That was a really good tip on the looking into the negotiation literature and stuff like that. Thank you so much.
Good. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I was just saying in our little side note, clip that that portion. That was really helpful too. Trevor, I see you just asked a question too around when you're the first data scientist. Do you want to jump in and ask that one?
Yeah, hi, hello everyone. Very interesting conversation with Jacqueline, right? So you spoke about like being the first data scientist in a company or being a startup. And the point that you made about also, do you have the data that you need to do data science? So I'm asking, when you typically enter a company, do they have the data already, and do they have it in a way that it is useful? Or do you also have to think about the structures that you need to put in place to get this data to a stage where you can use it to build models? I don't know what your experience has been like around that.
Yeah, so I think you're correct. And I think, yeah, you're the first person there, the data might not be in the right format for you, and you need to figure out how to make it the right format. You might have to build your own SQL database. You might have to set up a cloud thing. Like, you have to do a lot more of that work than if you were at an established company. Sometimes companies do have data engineering teams where they have data scientists, you know, if they have been collecting data and know it's valuable. So like it doesn't always end up being the case, but it is quite common. And I think that's part of the tricky part of being a first data scientist. I will also say that not only do you have to be a data engineer, but I think you also have to be a data analyst, which is a lot of your job as a first data scientist might just be taking data from a CSV, summarizing it, making it into one chart in a PDF file, and then emailing it to an executive, which I would argue is, you know, it's not like data science work, it's more like analytics. But like, that's part of your job too. And you're not going to get to always just build super cool models when you're the first person. And I think that comes with like the struggle of being the first, just like, you never know exactly what your job's going to be like, and you just have to be ready to roll with whatever punch that will help grow your team and your company. Also, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but I'm a very fidgety person, so I'm picking up like the thermos and my speaker and everything.
So could I ask a follow-up question there? Because if you're first data scientist, right? So the assumption there is that the company that you're being hired in, that they know what they want, right? So when they ask for a data scientist, I mean, do you see them asking for someone with a background in data engineering, or they don't know what they're asking for?
I think I have seen almost every time I've been on a start of a data science team, I think I would say 75% of the time, they did not actually know what they wanted. They knew they had data, and they knew that if you take data, it somehow turns you into money, or turns into money. Like, you know, they understood that from like, they read the Harvard Business Review articles, but they don't really know much more about that. And they know a data science person is the kind of person who does that. And so you, as the first hire, may have to come in and be like, actually, you don't even need me yet. You need a data engineer. Or actually, what you really need is not data science, but analytics, right? Like, there's so many angles it could go. And like, that's just how it is. And like, even companies that really seem like they should know what they want from data scientists, sometimes they just, unless you already have data science established, you don't really know what it's going to be like.
Thank you. And shifting gears a little bit to hiring conversation, I see Jeff, you just asked a question about hiring new talent. Would you want to ask that live? And I can read it as well. It says, as a data science leader, what are the pros and cons of hiring new talent or trying to upskill existing talent?
So I will say, I don't super feel like it's like a binary. I guess I always feel like as a leader, I always want to be upskilling my employees, which is to say, at every turn, I should be trying every day, regardless of hiring other people or anything like that, I should always be trying to make sure my employees are working on things that are challenging them and helping them grow and they learn new skills, both because that gets me more things that they can work on at the company, and it's good for them because they get new skills and have presumably more fun doing it. So like, I think that the upskilling is just like a perpetual push forward of people, and like that's like never changes. When it comes to like the pros and cons of hiring new talent, of like when is it valuable to grow your team, I really struggle with this because I do think that when you hire more people, then that actually is a really big burden on your team. Both like you have to give them work to do and make sure they are content and communicate with them and have them communicate. Like that's a big draw. So I think I tend to be a little bit more conservative in my hiring, just because I find that terrifying. I am more terrified than I am terrified of not having enough people, which is, I think, just my personal like personality showing up. But like, it's a very real calculation of like, how much do you want to take on the risk of like not having enough work and your team getting too big and blah, 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 versus the risk of missing opportunities because you didn't have people around. So that's kind of the challenge I'm always balancing. I also have a blog. If you want to know, like, literally, how do I like interview people and stuff, I do have a blog post series, which is on my personal website. If you scroll back in the blog enough, that goes into all of that. It's a little old, but like that thinking there. So like, I have that system pretty well figured out of like, if I'm looking for a data scientist, how do I get them in? The real risk is just, am I getting them in at the right time?
Thank you. And we can add that blog post to the chat as well,
Oh, yeah.
or if we can find it, Robert, maybe.
It's pretty easy. jnolis.com/blog. Click that a bunch.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And going back to the question right before this, someone just asked if we could clarify maybe what is the difference between a data scientist and a data analyst?
Oh, okay, great question. I would say a data analyst's job is to take raw data and get it into a consumable format for an executive, right? So if you have a SQL table, it's an analyst's job to turn it into an Excel file that has just the summary monthly numbers and put that in a dashboard and these sorts of things. This is a challenging job because, like, well, what are you if you're dealing with like sales data, what about returned objects? And what about this? And like, well, if we do that, then that retroactively changes last month's numbers. And that would be weird. Can we do that? Like, there's like a lot of work and thought that has to be into getting executives that data. A data scientist, in my opinion, is a person who's more focused on, they get in a data set and an abstract question of like, why are my customers churning? What is the best offer to give my customers? Things like that. And a data science job is to like build models, do regressions, forecast, whatever, to try and answer those things. So a data scientist is more about using models to answer questions and like do inference, whereas a data analyst doesn't really build models. They just take data and group, aggregate, summarize, and visualize in thoughtful ways that people within the company can use it. And I think companies have like 1,000 times more data analyst work than data scientist work. And I think there are a lot of data scientists there who like, I would never do data analyst work. And I know because I used to be one and I was very snobby about this early in my career, and now I do a lot of it and it's fine. But like, there's like a mental hurdle you have to get over of like, things aren't less interesting or numerically challenging just because they don't have a regression in them. So.
On the topic of roles, I see, Will, you just asked a question a few seconds ago. Would you want to ask that one now?
Yeah, sure. So as far as data science roles, I guess teams, you mentioned kind of a project manager earlier, data engineer, data scientist. What do you recommend as far as the types of roles in a data science team?
It super depends on what your team is doing. If your team is like primarily like making reports, doing analysis, doing an analytical, like trying to answer these questions with data, that is different than you're building actual models that are going into production, that sort of thing. I mean, obviously you need data scientists. I think after you have like 2 or 3 data scientists, you probably want to have like a principal person or like a person who is like job it is to like coach and help out on the other data scientists. So I think you need a lot of that. I also do think having someone whose job it is to do project management, which could very well be that principal, that's valuable too. I think having a manager is good if you get big enough. Again, a principal style person can also be a manager and a manager could be a project manager. So there's all kind of overlap. But like, okay, so I'm gonna start over. Here's what you need. You need data scientists to do the work. You need someone whose job it is to help those people technically when they're not sure about stuff. which could be convincing them to do unit tests or whatever and checking for that. You need someone who's a manager whose job it is to figure out that the work coming in makes sense, right? Like a manager's job is to like, hey, are we working on the right stuff? Are we asking the right tests? Are our employees growing and are they getting the right comp or whatever? Like that kind of stuff. And you need someone who's a project manager, which is like literally like, hey, person X from this department asks us to do this. Does that request make sense? Do we need to flesh it out? How does that fit into our like list of work? That's like 5 roles on that team. A lot of those can be bunched into the same person, but depending on what your company is like, it may make sense to do that bunching differently. In like the most abstract case, you have 3 data scientists and manager, principal, project manager person does all the other stuff. But I think it really depends.
Thank you.
So follow-up question from the analyst and data science topic as well. If you're a data analyst today, what tips do you have on making that transition over to data science?
So I think it's a lot about learning the regressions, learning the models, getting more comfortable, right? Because analysts are more likely to use SQL and Excel and those sorts of tools than R and Python. And the more you can get comfortable with R and Python, the better. Like there are boot camps, right? Like a data science boot camp is a thing designed to get you those skills you need real quickly. It's also at some level, so it's at some level getting those skills you are missing. But a lot of times when people ask this question, it's because they are an analyst and they are interested in this stuff and they learn some R in their free time. And now they're trying to figure out, but how do I actually get the better job? And then at that point, it's a lot of like crafting your resume and stuff to like actually like highlight that, hey, analyst work is very similar to data science work. So look, it's not really much of a stretch at all for you to switch positions. So at some level, it's about like marketing yourself as it is as much about getting the right skills and things like that, or using internal opportunities if you can switch teams and that sort of thing to see if someone could switch you within your org to get more work. I will say I have co-wrote a whole book that has discussions about these sorts of things, and you can get it at bestbook.cool with the offer code BuildBook 40% for 40% off.
Love it. On that topic as well, I just remembered there was a question from earlier that I hadn't asked yet, and this might be in your book too, but when you do determine that it's time to leave a company, how do you explain that departure when looking for the next job?
Okay, so we do have a whole chapter on leaving your company. What I do is, I mean, I guess it like super depends. If it like I think it's very, oftentimes people don't even ask because they don't see it, like it's often not super relevant. If they do ask, you can be like, hey, you know, I've been at the company for a few years and I was looking for a new opportunity, and that's fine. And people will be like, cool, got it, you got bored, no problem. I've been in situations where like I actually left because of the stuff we talked about earlier. Like I have an incredibly toxic boss or whatever. And like what I do there is when I go to my interviews, I say, they're like, well, why'd you leave? I'm like, well, you know, after being there for 6 months, it's just very clear that there wasn't necessarily a fit in terms of what they wanted data scientists to do and that what I thought was the right stuff to do. It just like wasn't a quite right fit. And that's like a wink, wink, nudge, nudge for like, it was a bad toxic environment, but like no one questions it. So like, there's a lot of ways you can say, I don't like working there anymore. That's still like middle class sound, like, look, we're being professional and fun, aren't we? And I think that you just kind of have to like practice saying the words a few times and then go into the meeting and it's fine.
I like that, like actually practicing saying that out loud first.
Yeah, gotta break it in a little.
There's a few other anonymous questions that just came in, so I'll read them. One is, if you're talking to an executive leader, how would you explain the core value that a data science team brings to the organization?
So how would I if like I get asked into the office by a CEO of big name company, 27, like Fortune 40 company, whatever. And they're like, Jacqueline, what is data science? Why should companies use data science? I would say, look,
I forgot to use my executive voice when I was asking that question.
Let me grab my martini. No, so I would say, look, companies, you generally collect lots of data. What products people are buying, how they are using them, blah, blah, blah. You also have to make a ton of decisions, both like in the abstract sense, should we use that data to do stuff, like, or sorry, in the abstract sense of like, should we launch a new product or not? Like, or like that's just a decision we have to make. And then like a very like concrete day-to-day question of like, hey, should we send this customer this offer, blah, blah, blah. You could totally make that decision in a vacuum, and that's fine, and companies have done that for a long time. But like, wouldn't it be a little bit better if you use all that data to try and do things like, hey, let's not send the customers who will purchase from us regardless of if we give them a coupon. Let's not just hand them a coupon and lose money, right? So like, or, you know, when it comes to that product, we can clearly tell from data that like that product probably won't be helpful for people. Let's know that. And so I don't think data science ever gets you like your company went from a failing company to a huge success of data science. But I do think like you can like on the margin improve your product a reasonable amount and like make things a bit better by having data science. So I don't think like data science is the right thing for every company to suddenly grow huge. But I really do think, especially for bigger companies with lots of data and lots of opportunities to improve stuff, that data can be just a very nice way to kind of flesh things out. That is my...
Thank you. That was
That's
great.
why I'm running for president of data science.
So another question for you as president of data science. Do you have any tips for pitching machine learning projects to non-technical leadership, specifically a mid-sized company that has not had a formal machine learning project in the past?
I think what I honestly think there is that's less about really machine learning projects can be huge to implement, but they can be pretty fast to show that they would be valuable, right? So if your idea is we're going to try and find customers and use a machine learning model for which coupon they're going to get, it may be a huge effort to get the data sets all connected and blah, 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 and actually have this run every day. But it's pretty quick to take a one-time extract of the data, run a model on it and show, look, we think that these customers would behave differently, right? Like, so like, with machine learning, I feel like since so much of the work is actually the productionizing, you can sometimes like under the radar do the work of proving it's valuable, then go shop that to everyone. Be like, hey, isn't this cool? Wouldn't it be cool if it happened every day automatically for our customers? And that at that point, I find it very easy to get executives who see a POC of machine learning to like buy in. It's the hard part is like just making sure you can actually craft the POC in the first place. POC being proof of concept. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm scrolling through to see if there are other questions that I've missed so far. So feel free to jump in live too.
Well, if you're not going to talk, okay, I have another question about engineering. So I'm curious how, for your engineering needs, like putting things into production or creating servers specifically for your work, do you have your data scientists or a part of your team that can overlap between those two worlds?
Yes, both the data scientists have to become, they don't have to like write like the best code in the world in like C++, but they have to like, you know, be comfortable with the idea of like a Docker container, of a unit test. And that stuff I have found it's not very hard to teach a data scientist. I was a data scientist who did not know that stuff at one point, and now I do. I don't think it's that hard. I think data scientists are sometimes intimidated by that and they need good mentorship, but I don't think the actual knowledge is hard to learn. What is critically important is that your team is partnered with an engineering team, right? So whether you actually have engineers within your group who will do this, or the engineers who are going to be rolling this out sit right next to you, or you have everyday stand-ups, things like that. Because if you don't have that super good communication, it's just not going to work, both because the data scientists aren't going to build something that the engineers use, but also the engineers will not be able to provide some of that mentorship in like, hey, what do we look for in unit tests? Or what do our Docker files? How do our Docker files, you know, our Docker containers roll out? So for machine learning stuff, it's just essential that you have engineers and data scientists very close together and collaborating.
How have you gotten that to happen? It seems hit and miss with me. I can get certain people who seem to speak like a very more traditional IT, and it works well there.
Sorry, how do you hire data scientists to do that?
No.
How do you get the engineering team?
How do you get to the that communication going better? Like I've not been totally successful unless the data scientist is more intrinsically interested in like the more IT portions.
I do think there is an intrinsic interest part. Like I do think that stuff matters, but I also think what matters is the engineering team like doing this for your team as a favor in their extra time if they have it, or is like part of their core charter to help the data science team roll out data science. Because I've been in both those situations, and unless they are not like the thing they are hired as engineers to do is support the data science team, it's very hard to get them to care, because like, I don't know, people like working with people who know their stuff. So it's a lot easier for engineers to just keep, not communicate. Similarly, data scientists are much happier to communicate with other data scientists than data engineers. So it's really like levels above this, making sure that the two teams are like, the leaders are talking and and like, it's like, and it's not like just that engineering team does 8 things, of which 1/8 of that is support the data scientists.
I think that's what I need. It's a charter on my engineering team. Okay.
Yeah.
I see, Mike, you just asked a question that came in. Do you want to jump in live?
Sure, I can jump in live. Jacqueline, I'm also a big fan as well. And I know that I think you've talked about data science consulting on your Becoming a Data Scientist podcast at one point, but it's been a little while since I listened to it. So I figured I might ask this question again. And you mentioned that you worked in data science consulting, at one point in your career. I was wondering if you have any sort of tips, tricks, best practices that are unique to finding success as a data science consultant, and in the consulting world, dealing with a lot of non-technical stakeholders as well, the sales process of selling your value. That's unique to being a consultant as opposed to an employee.
Yeah, so I will say, I do talk about in the book, I have like loosely toyed with the idea of like writing like a 5-chapter ebook just on consulting data science, because so many people have your question of like, I find this stuff interesting. How would I, a data scientist, get into consulting? So consulting has a pattern, like, okay, so super high level, how do companies hire people? They have employees, full-time employees. They have, it's generally called like contractors or vendors who are like, hey, we just need you for a certain number of months to just work as like our team. And then they also have like consultants, like more consultants, like we're bringing you in for a very specific task. So it is possible to, as a individual, be in that last group of like, people know you as like, you're a good person for this kind of stuff, so they're just going to bring you in. By far the hardest part of all of this is getting companies to know and trust you, and like finding the work is 1,000 times harder than doing the work. For me, I had worked at consulting companies for many years, so like I had built connections with like companies I had consulted for as part of one point, and then I was able to talk to them as an individual. So like a lot of it is just that is how I built the network. There's multiple ways to build the network, or like of people you work with. And more than anything, what I recommend if you're interested in this kind of stuff is like try and find someone who would hire you, and then do it in your free time, like do it in your evenings and weekends and that sort of stuff. Because if you do it that way, it's like you're testing it out, and if it works, that's some nice side income, which can be really valuable. And I recommend charging charge more than just whatever your hourly salary is, like double or triple that. And then if you do that and do that enough times and you like it and stuff, then you can start thinking about making it your full-time life. But that's a hard thing. I also think working at a consulting firm is a very valuable way to learn these sorts of things in terms of like, well, how do you make that first contract? And what is the sales cycle like? There's just a lot to that is unrelated to data science and just a standard consulting thing. But like, it just takes time to like figure out the beats of it. And it's something that it's helpful to like try and experience or like get an insight into how that works before you go out on your own and so that kind of stuff. Which is to say that being a data science consultant is very little about being a good data scientist and extremely much about being a good salesperson, thinking through contracts, thinking about like what's going to happen if this company won't pay you for 4 months. Like it's like that kind of management and all that kind of stuff, which can be fun and eventually, very financially lucrative if you can pull it off, but it is also tricky and I no longer do it. So did that answer your question? I don't know. That's a big, I would write an ebook about this. So.
That's super helpful. Thank you, Jacqueline. And as we get to the top of the hour too, I just want to make sure to ask, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you if they have follow-up questions? Is it Twitter or LinkedIn?
That's a great question. I don't really check LinkedIn. Please Twitter, DM me at Skytetra, SKYETETRA. That is the best way to get it. And like a lot of my talks and blog posts and stuff, I have on my personal websites. If you just go to jnolis.com, you can see a lot of my past material. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Are there any other questions from anyone? That I don't think I missed any from the chat, but if so, please jump in. Just seeing a lot of thank you so much, Jacqueline. That was awesome. It was really fun chatting with you. I really appreciate your time and looking forward to hopefully having you on here at a future session too.
Perfect. Yes, this is a lot of fun. So thank you for inviting me. It's mostly just getting to rant about stuff I like ranting about. So it's great.
Awesome. Thank you, Jacqueline. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.